For years, there's been a number of different web frameworks for driving the browser. We've had, first, there was Water by Brett Petticord, and it was a very good framework. Unfortunately, it's only been designed for Rubyists. Then came along Jason Huggins, and he created Selenium. And it's written in JavaScript, and it was designed to be almost like Fit, so that you create a wiki of what your test is going to do, and then it'll run from top to bottom. And that's where everything started with that. And then along came Simon Stewart, and he created WebDriver, and it's a developers framework for developers. So it's been designed by a developer for developers. Unfortunately, when it was originally created, it had one downside. It worked on one browser and one headless browser. The one browser is IE, and the headless browser is HTML unit. So it didn't really get enough traction, but it did really cool things. But let's start by checking what we know about Selenium. So with Selenium, we have the IDE, the Firefox add-on. It allows you to create your test by doing record, replay. And then we have the RC, the remote control. This allows you to, in your favorite language, create a Selenium test and then run it from top to bottom with your favorite, with using a testing framework. And then if we want to run tests in parallel, run tests on multiple browsers at the same time, Grid was created. And then Grid allows us to just expand really quickly how much testing we're going to do and how quickly we're going to do it. The core of Selenium is written in JavaScript, so it means it works on any browser that supports JavaScript. So this includes mobile devices nowadays. But because people have become reliant on Selenium RC, it makes things difficult for them on mobile. But it's still a very good framework. But because it's written in JavaScript, it's also limited by the problems that JavaScript has. JavaScript in a browser can only do certain things according to the JavaScript sandbox within the browser. So if you wanted to access something like a file upload, Selenium can't do that because the browser will block it, because the browser does it normally so that people can't steal your passwords off your computer. Then we have WebDriver. So Selenium 2 is the merger between Selenium and WebDriver, giving all the good parts. So when WebDriver was originally created, it only did the two browsers. As of today, it does all of these browsers. So there's a driver for each browser. And the reason why each of these is an individual driver is that where possible, the driver will bind directly onto the browser and do things as close and natively to the browser. So with Selenium 1, if you wanted to start up a browser, you need to start up the Selenium RC. Then you need your test to then speak to Selenium RC, which would then start the browser. With WebDriver, you don't need Selenium RC. If you want to speak directly to the browser, you just go, "Can I please have a browser?" and it starts one up. But this has its a few drawbacks. So if we take, for example, the Chrome driver, which is for Google Chrome, it uses the Chrome layer, like with Selenium IDE, to speak to the browser to tell it what to do. so it's all written in JavaScript. But if we look at something like Internet Explorer driver, the core code for that is written all in C++ because that's the best way to speak to Internet Explorer. And so we can go through the list like that. So like with the Android driver, it's got its own APK that you can install onto your phone, onto a simulator and things like that. And the same with the iPhone driver. It uses native installations to drive the web views within the mobile devices. And then obviously we have the remote WebDriver, which allows you to, if you need to speak to a browser on a different machine, like Selenium RC would do, you can do that with the remote WebDriver. So if we have a look at how it really does it, is that we have the browser at the top, and then the languages that need to speak to it. So the driver does what we call best fit. And this is why I was saying that we have a C++ for Internet Explorer, we have JavaScript for Firefox and Chrome. Opera does things through protocol buffers so that it can access different instances or different ways into the browser and gain access to the DOM and things like that. But once we have that driver, we can then start seeing about driving things a lot better. But it also means that we're not bound by the JavaScript sandbox anymore. So if I show you an example, and I'm going to make this example as hard as possible for me, is that I'm going to do this in Internet Explorer because Internet Explorer tends to show things a lot worse when things don't go right. So, with Selenium, I work in Python, so hopefully my demos are going to be in Python because that's my main language at the moment, but it should be understandable for you. So, usual. So, just so that we know what's on the page, the yellow box is a content editable area. So it's just a div that I've said, right, I can type into this div. And then obviously we have a file upload. So if we try to type into the editable area, it shouldn't write anything. So we don't have a failure. Selenium has not said, I can't type in there, but we can clearly see that nothing's been typed there. And the same if I were to try into the file upload. But if we change this, and instead now we're going to use Selenium 2, one thing to notice is I haven't said where, like if there's a remote or anything like that. And if we were to look at what's come out of the Selenium RC, there's nothing to say that it started up a browser. Let me see. So we can see that it's done a test complete, which means it's tearing down the browser, but then there's nothing else after it. But we have a browser. So if we then tell it to open that page, one thing to notice is that the API is extremely different. There's big breaking changes. But I'll explain this a little bit further along the way. So here we have the same page that we had before. And I'm going to try to type into the content editable area again. So now we can see that we suddenly start typing into things like this. And the reason why we can suddenly start typing into content editable areas is when we do typing, especially on Linux and on Windows, we're doing it at a more native level. So we're telling the operating system, please type the following into that area. We know where it is. You just need to send the keystrokes to it, please. And we can do things like that. Now, let's have a look at doing a file upload. I'm just going to type into there so that you can see it. What it's going to do, I'm going to tell it to upload that Python script. So it's just going to go into the desktop, look for it, and then upload, or like put it into the area for us. Just so that we have full credits.
Mistake. You forgot to enter pass into this file.
No.
After file upload.
Yeah. Sorry, my bad. in this case, I know it's going to go to the desktop, but you can put the path to it. So now suddenly we get file uploads and we can control all of that. And this is because we're doing best fit for the browser. We can control what the browser is doing and how it's doing it. So this is why we're doing a merger between the two languages, so that we can start getting better access to the browser, so we can get across a number of problems. So with all these different languages, how do each of the with all the different ways to grab the browser and control the browser, how do we actually control what the browser is doing? So for me, I do Python, I do .NET, and I want to be able to just move between those languages and understand what I'm doing. And especially as a committer, I need to be able to go, right, it needs to speak to the browser this way to do the following, so that we can have file uploads or whatever. And the way it does it is that we have a REST-ish, it's almost like REST, that's why it's got the ish, way to speak to the browser. We have what we call the JSON wire protocol. So in Internet Explorer, our C++ binding starts up an internal web server that we then speak to, and then we control the browser that way. And it gives us a number of easy routes into new browsers. So if a new browser binding was to be created, we don't have to change the language binding below it. So we wouldn't have to change Python to speak to Opera, or to speak to Chrome. Is that we make one API for, say, Python, for Java, for .NET, for Ruby, and then it knows that if you speak to a different browser, it's just going to work. Obviously, if it supports it. So let's clarify why the merger is happening. So for years, Selenium has been used. It has a really large user base. The community is really big. This is a very good example. Conferences like this or get-togethers like this are very good examples of why Selenium is such a very good thing. But for years, it supports better browsers. If a new browser were to be launched, say, Apple decide that they're going to get rid of Safari and they're going to launch a brand new browser from scratch. They're not going to use WebKit. WebDriver wouldn't be able to support that browser for quite a while, because we need to find what's the best fit for that browser to get access to it. Where Selenium, you just go, there's my new browser, there's the executable to start it up, and Selenium will just go work in it, because it's all in JavaScript, and JavaScript needs to work on all browsers these days. So Selenium is better than WebDriver. But from my demo, we can see that WebDriver is better than Selenium in certain aspects. It has more native control of the browser. So where Selenium, if you said type something into a text box, it would actually just change the value of the text box. So it would almost make you think that it was typing, but it didn't actually. Where WebDriver, if you tell it to type something, it will type it. And that's why the API is called send keys, is that we're telling WebDriver to send keys to the operating system. Selenium has somewhere in the region of 140 API calls on it, which makes it very hard to always know what's the right thing to do. Have we all had the problem where we need to click a button, but the click never works? And then we go, right, let me do a mouse down. Or that didn't work either. Let me do a mouse up. Oh wait, that did work. Yeah, I can now use Selenium for this. Where WebDriver, if you do a click, it fires all the events that are required from a click. And it does it more natively. So it will do the mouse down, press, and mouse up. All for you, so you never have to go, right, did I do the right thing? And it keeps things more succinct. So like, if we have a look at what I was doing here before, so with Selenium 2, I asked for a browser, then I tell it to get me the page, because get is the more understandable way because it's how HTTP works. You do an HTTP get, that's why it's like that. And then the big difference is if you want something on the page, you go, find me that element. What that does is it returns you an object representing that element. And then that object has its own API against elements on the page, or like what it can do. So you couldn't like go where Selenium, you would go Selenium, type something in there, and that's what you want to type. You need to go, give me an element, then type in it. And it makes things much easier to understand. It also means that you're not constantly polling the browser, because if you want to type something in an element, say 5 times, with Selenium 1, it has to go find the element every single time. With Selenium 2, it knows where the element is, it just sends through the keystrokes. So it makes things run a little bit quicker. Then obviously, because it's not constantly going through a middleman like Selenium RC, it runs a lot quicker. I've seen cases where Selenium 2 is running at least 3 times faster. But if you then factor in something like Internet Explorer and you're using XPath, I've seen it go up to about 10 times faster. So it makes things a lot better. And it can scale a lot better than Selenium. We've all heard of Google's Selenium farm with supposedly 5,000 machines running Selenium constantly. But the one thing that you always need with Selenium 1 is you always need the Selenium RC, which then suddenly, because it's in Java, you know, not everyone wants to speak to that, like they don't want to go through Java, especially if you speak to .NET people or Python people or Ruby people. They don't really like the idea that they have to get their Ruby code to speak to Java to then drive the browser, where they can go Ruby code straight into the browser and do like its REST type calls. So it means that we can scale down, it means we don't need Selenium server, but then we can scale up. We can go really, really big. So we can, one of the nice things with Selenium 2 is that you can start controlling the ports that are, the browser's working on. So if we go back here, when I did this, the code went and found a free port on the machine. One of the disadvantages of, like, say, Internet of Windows is it has this idea of ephemeral ports, and that it can only control certain amounts of ephemeral ports, and then it makes things harder. Like on Mac or Linux, we can suddenly scale this a lot better because we can control ports a lot better, and we can scale to like really, really large. I know of 2 committers that are running at least 36 instances of Firefox on one machine because they can control how the browser starts up and things like that. And this is the idea that Selenium 2 was built by developers for developers. Because if you're writing your tests in Python, .NET, Java, Ruby, you are a developer. There's one thing you have to always remember, it's not that you're just a tester, you are developing something. So, I'm going to do another demo now, but this is more just so we can get a better understanding of how the API works. I'm going to do this one on my Mac now. As we can see, like with Chrome, we can actually see the web server running because it creates a tab, and we always need that tab open for it to work. And all the Selenium commands will go through this tab, and then it will control the next tab. One of the things I like about Python is that we can always see what type of object is called if we're working in the interactive shell. So here is a good example of how if you want to find an element, you tell it what that element is, and it returns you a new element that we can now work with. And we can do the same for the file upload. So yeah, we're always getting what we call a web element. This is an element that represents something on the DOM. One of the things that should always be known about Selenium 2 is you can get an element back if that's on the DOM. But if the element's hidden, so it has a style of like display none or that, if you were to then try and interact with that element, WebDriver or Selenium 2 will throw an error because we've tried to make things more how a user would do things. We've all hit situations where we want to type into, like, say, a WYSIWYG editor. You know, like we designed something on a web page, and normally they have a element that gets loaded behind and it's hidden, and we tend to type into that, and somehow JavaScript will then push it forward. So like FCK editor and things like that tends to do things like that. If you try with Selenium 2 to do that, it will throw an error going invalid operation on that element. So it makes things, so your tests are suddenly doing what the user can do, and means that we can get more reliance from our tests, and we can actually believe they're doing the right thing. So But because we're getting elements back, we're suddenly starting to go into a more object-orientated way of developing our tests. And we all know like Java and .NET and Ruby and Python, they're all object-orientated languages, so we should use them as such. So what is the merger looking like? What we're doing is we're just putting the Selenium 2 code, or like the WebDriver code, next to the Selenium 1 code. So what you could do in Selenium 1, that's all there. There's no breaking functionality where possible. If there is, it tends to be because of a bug, because we're doing something. And then what we're calling a Uber jar is the WebDriver's remote server and Selenium RC are now in one big jar file. So if you were to, so if you're running the Selenium RC, sorry, it's at the bottom. But we can see there's the Selenium server, and then we have the WebDriver server at the bottom. Really sorry that I can't make it up, people. But it means that suddenly we got two loads of Selenium that we can now control, and then we can easily move between Selenium 1 and Selenium 2. And we're starting to break up Selenium into more manageable pieces. There's a number of bits of code that are exactly the same. So like in Chrome and Firefox, we know that the way we control the browser is via JavaScript, and the way we control the browser via Selenium is through JavaScript. So suddenly there's a lot of shared code. And we're breaking these up into what we call atoms. And we call them atoms because they're the smallest amounts of code to get the same amount of functionality. So if you want get text, there'll be a JavaScript file just for get text. And then when we do our build, we compile all the JavaScript files using Google's Closure into one file that we can then manage. And it means that we can generate some really nice JavaScript that is smaller, so that if we control the browser, Selenium's not as sluggish because there's not as much JavaScript that was there before. And so that's how we're starting to we're breaking things up. So when can you start using Selenium 2? Well, you can it's been available for quite a while now. We're in our second beta release of Selenium 2, and hopefully within the next couple of weeks we're going to be doing our third beta release. And each time we do a beta release, we're adding more functionality. One of the downsides so far has been, or up until beta 2, had been we couldn't control alerts and prompts. So if you do a JavaScript alert because something's gone wrong on the page, or you need to prompt like the user for something, and you throw a dialog window, Selenium 2 couldn't handle that. But now with beta 2 release, we've actually got that. And again, it's doing things more natively. So where Selenium 1 would override the alerts, Selenium 2 doesn't override them. It just knows that the dialog is visible and that we can control it. Because with things like this, the browser needs to know that the dialog is visible and we can control it can control it. So what the browser knows, we are able to know now. So if we the upgrade path from Selenium 1 to Selenium 2 is really, really easy. we've tried our utmost to make sure that where possible, everything is backwards compatible. Selenium 1's been around for a good 5 years, and that means around the world there's a lot of tests with a lot of companies, and especially big companies. So if you take Google, Microsoft, eBay, they all use Selenium. So we need to make sure that we don't really annoy them, as well as like annoying a number of consultancies that use Selenium on big projects. So where possible, we've tried to make it backwards compatible. So the idea is that with a 2-line change to your code, you can suddenly be running Selenium 2. It's still going to go through the it's going to be doing what we call like a mock remote driver, but it means that you can either tell it to go through, you can start using it directly to the browser, your Selenium 1 test directly into the browser like we were doing earlier, or you can do it through Selenium RC or Selenium Server. And the change is that normally we would go, we want a Selenium object, and we would fill in a whole bunch of parameters to go and tell it where the remote control is, what port it's on, what browser we needed, and the base URL that we're going to test. With Selenium 2, if we just put these 2 lines instead of the instantiation, so we just, instead of like Selenium equals new default Selenium, we just go, we create a WebDriver, and then we go with Selenium, please use a WebDriver backed version of Selenium, and I want you to use my driver, and that's where I want to test. So that's your upgrade path. So it means that suddenly you don't have to worry about, it's like, I have to rewrite thousands of tests and thousands of lines of code need to change because the API has changed. We try to make this extremely easy to upgrade for basic users. And it's working quite well. We've, it is limited in that if you're using a lot of user extensions, with Selenium 1, they're not really supported yet with Selenium 2, but we are only in beta. We haven't done an official, this is the final version release yet, but it's something that we're still looking at. But because it's suddenly, we've done this, all our commands will work, and whatever WebDriver can do, or Selenium 2, you can suddenly do it, and you're using the old 140 APIs that you were using before. So what's happening with Grid? Well, Grid's had a bit of a funny history. It was first developed by ThoughtWorks. It's one of these things that it's a bit of code that's never really made its way into the Selenium code base. So if you were to, or up until recently, if you were to want to work on it, you would need to go onto GitHub because it was in someone's personal repository, even though it was an official release. So it's had a bit of a funny old life. But what's happened now is that eBay have kindly donated, they've rewritten Grid, and what's now called Grid 2 is they've donated all the source code to us, and what it does is it supports both Selenium 1 API and Selenium 2. So with Grid, if you wanted to speak to something, like if you wanted to do something, it would go to the hub, then from the hub it would get redirected to where it needed to be, and then the hub is just acting as a multiplexer, passing through commands as it needs. And it's still REST-ish way to do things, but now we can start doing things with the remote WebDriver. We can start, like, if you want to do with Grid 2, you'll be able to do mobile development. So that you can suddenly go there at that point on my grid is an Android device or an iPhone or an iPad, and we can suddenly start controlling them, and we can do it via the grid, so we can start seeing how our tests are working on mobile. Mobile support, we have great support for Android devices and for iOS, so you can run Selenium 2 on your iPad, on your iPhone, your Galaxy Tab, on your Android device if you've got a Nexus or whatever. You can suddenly start running Selenium 2. And it makes things a lot easier. The way it does it is it does it via the remote WebDriver. So you, like, in each, because we've decided that we're going to do things in a more like REST-ish way of doing it, is that there'll be a web server installed on each device, so on an Android or on iOS. And it, so if you're on Android, you install your APK and it just works. So let me show you loading a page. I do apologise that my mobile web development is quite poor, so I've just done a very basic page, but it means that we can change the page and I can show you that it's still going to reload it. So, the capabilities part here just shows that I've got control of it. So in this case, I'm just going to tell it to get a page off my local web server. So now we can start controlling mobile devices, and it's the same API that we were doing before, and we can we don't have to change anything. The only thing we need to do is to say I would like an iPhone, or we change that to say I'd like an Android or whatever, and suddenly we can control it. Just if there's any skeptics, I can see it. We'll just change the page so that we can show that it's something local. Oh no. this is always where things go horribly wrong. Okay, it's all going to work this time. Better if I tell it to get from the right place. So yeah, we can certainly now control mobile devices, and it's just as simple as it was before. So the future is Selenium 2 is now being put into browsers where possible. Chromium has WebDriver built in, so we no longer have to maintain that. Opera has done the exact same, and we're hoping that we can start doing the same. We're going to be expanding that. Mozilla's looking into doing it at the moment, but it means that we as a project no longer have to try to work out what's the best way to control the browser. The browser manufacturers know how browsers work, so they're the best people to look after it. So Chromium, I think it's already in the Chromium tree. I don't know if it's been released yet. And Opera have released it with their Opera driver. You can get that off their GitHub. You can have a look at it and start playing with it right now. Unfortunately, Opera driver only works with Java, but you can start messing around with it. And that's it. Any questions?
Mobile platform is supported only within months, maybe iPhone.
So the question was, is it only supported on iPhone?
iPhone can be tested only on Macintosh.
If you want to use the so the question is, can iPhone only be tested with Macs? No, it can only be tested on a Mac. You have to have a Mac if you want to use the simulator. I don't have an iPhone, so I can't, and it doesn't really demo that well with people like this, so I've used the simulator from it. But you can install it directly onto the phone, and you can install it onto an iPad and then control it that way. So you don't have to have a Mac to do it. So as long as you have the phone, you can do it that way. And the same with Android. You can install it onto the device and control it directly on the device instead of using the simulator.
Okay, and another question about game consoles. They also have browsers.
So questions about game consoles browsers. At the moment, we don't support it. A lot of game console browsers tend to use something like a form of Opera, and since Opera is starting to do things, hopefully it wouldn't be too long until Opera would, like on a Wii, they use Opera. Then hopefully we can, we'll get Opera support on Wii, just because they're baking Selenium 2 directly into the browser, and we don't have to control that anymore.
To run it on iPhone, you need an application, and this means you have to have this application in App Store, right?
I think. Well, I know you can install things like in the developer mode onto iPhones. That's how we do it. We don't. The WebDriver would never pass App Store rules because we're controlling the phone, so we can't. It's never going to pass any of the App Store rules. So, and because we're constantly developing it, it takes somewhere in the region of a week for an app on the App Store to go through the whole process. And a week we could have potentially rewritten the whole way we do things. and re-release it. So we don't tend to go to the App Store for that.
I have two questions. My first question about moving Selenium 1 to Selenium 2.
Yeah.
So your example showed that you could use find by ID.
Yeah.
Could you use something like find by XPath or find by CSS?
Yeah. So the questions were like Selenium 1, like Selenium 2, you can do find by whatever, like ID. In my example, I was just using ID because I knew the ID and I did it. But you can do by XPath. You can expand it. So like if you were to change something, you could do. You could do something, that's not very good, but you could do something like that. Where I was doing this, it's just a helper method that I've put into the code. So because with Python, I've tried to make the structure as flat as possible. You can do by XPath, by CSS, by class name, if you just want to, like if it's just that. And you can find elements. The way you would find the elements in Selenium 1, you can find them in Selenium 2. It's just the API to find it is different. And then obviously, like we were doing type keys in Selenium 1. In Selenium 2, we would do send keys and things like that.
Yes, thank you. And the second question: what about testing Flex and Flash application? Would Selenium 2 will support it or not?
The official answer for would Selenium 2 work with Flex and Flash? The official answer is no, and we don't have any plans to support it. It's the same with Silverlight. We don't have any plans to support it. It's items that we consider a black box within the browser, so there is no real DOM element, so the browser doesn't actually know what's in there. We don't really officially want to support that. We don't mind helping out on community projects like FlexMonk and things like that. We will help out on those, but officially we're not going to support them.
Okay.
What about Microsoft Phone 7 support? Do you have plans?
I had a microphone and Phone 7 support. I had a look at it. Phone 7 is not very good for actually doing a lot of things when it comes to developers. And this is my opinion. The reason why we can't control it is with, like say with iPhone, we've said we've got an application running here, and then here's our web view. With Phone 7, we couldn't have this part and this part. Because if you, say, fire up the server, then you go, get me a page, it'll load the web view, and will tombstone the server. So then you can't control the browser because the server's now opened the page and you no longer have control of the browser. Okay. Sorry, that's time, people. Thank you so much for listening to my talk.